Imagine being 7 years old and waking to the sound of your father screaming, not shouting, screaming like a wounded animal being dragged across splintered floors. Imagine pressing your face against the cracks in a wooden wall as men with boots and torches pull him from your home because he hesitated to bow, because he looked a white man in the eye, because he had pride. Josiah remembered the way the torches lit his father's face in flashes, rage, then confusion, then something like acceptance. They didn't let him say goodbye, just took him. That night, the sky cracked with the thunder and the rain came down hard, but the screaming never stopped. Not really. It echoed across the quarters like a warning. Sound of silence. Past the fields, past the coos, past old Hannah's shack with the broken door. He found his father hanging from a crooked cypress tree by the edge of the swamp, caked in mud, his eyes open to a sky that never blinked. Crows circled overhead, one perched on his shoulder, like it had been waiting all night. They didn't let Lottie, Josiah's mother, cut him down. They said the __ died with pride. Let him rot with it. A field hand did it in secret at dusk, burying the body in a hole too shallow for peace. Josiah helped pack the dirt, one handful, but a time, his arms trembling, his face blank. That, not a word, not a whisper. Once the most spirited woman on the plantation, a midwife, a singer, a mother of 3 before death claimed the others. She became a ghost in a linen dress. She spent her days scrubbing floors that weren't dirty, polishing iron that didn't shine, folding rags into neat squares and unfolding them again. Her eyes stopped seeing people. She drifted like ash from one task to another, her body present but hollowed out from the inside. Josiah tried to talk to her. He brought her mint leaves for tea, sugar cubes he'd stolen from the big house, a polished stone shaped like a heart. She never looked at him. She'd just hum an old spiritual under her breath, a melody that sounded more like a moan. He'd sit beside her at night, arms around her knees, hoping for the warmth of her voice. Word, just one. Then came the night. The master's eldest son, a pale, heavy man, named Charles, with the breath of rotting peaches, entered their cabin after dark. Josiah lay curled in the corner on a rag-stuffed mat, pretending to sleep. He watched from behind a sheet as Charles stood over his mother, said nothing, just reached out and grabbed her wrist. Lottie didn't fight, didn't scream. She rose like someone answering a chore and followed him out, her feet dragging on the dirt floor with the last sound Josiah heard before the door closed. He stayed awake all night, his heart beating so hard he thought it might crack a rib. She returned before dawn, her dress torn at the neckline, dried blood on her thigh, and a single twig caught in her hair. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at nothing. That morning she washed the blood off her legs at the pump, while a bird sang in the trees. Josiah watched her from a distance, clutching the stone heart in his fist until his knuckles bled. The following weeks were quiet. Too quiet. Lottie stopped folding rags. She stopped humming. Her hands shook when she held anything. Once Josiah reached to touch her cheek, and she flinched like he'd struck her. 3 months later, on a gray morning heavy with fog, she tied a faded red scarf around her head, the same one she wore on her wedding day, and walked barefoot toward the river. She didn't pack anything, didn't leave a note, kissed Josiah's forehead for the first time in months, and in a voice so soft it sounded like wind, she whispered, "I'm going to wash the blood out." Josiah followed her halfway. He stopped when she reached the water's edge. He watched her step into the river slowly, like she was walking into church. The water reached her shoulders. She looked back once, not at him, but at the sky, and then let herself sink. Never came back. The overseers said she'd gone mad, just like her man. Weak kind of slave. they said. Better off gone. But Josiah knew better. Seen madness before. This wasn't madness. This was what was left when the world took everything. Her man, her dignity, her voice, and left her with only the memory of pain. The river until nightfall, staring at the place where the water swallowed her. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. Returned to the quarters. He looked 10 years older. Something had changed behind his eyes. Not broken, not shattered, closed. From that day forward, he stopped asking questions, stopped waiting for kindness. He worked silently, kept to the edges of the world, watching and absorbing. The stillness of the kitchen, in the scent of grease and ash, a hunger began to rise inside him. Not for food, not for comfort, but for balance. And one day that hunger would be fed. Age of 10, Josiah was reassigned to the kitchen, not as punishment, but because he didn't fit in the fields. Overseers called him unnerving. He didn't speak much. He didn't cry when he was whipped, didn't beg when they withheld his food. Patient. There was something about the way he looked at people that made even grown men shift in their boots. Small for his age, wiry, fast-moving, the kind of child that slipped into rooms without being noticed and left without a sound. They said he didn't smile, not even as a baby. Mother walked into the river. He became even quieter. He ate when told, slept when told. But his eyes, those eyes, moved constantly, as if he were taking notes on the world and tucking them into a dark place no one could reach. The kitchen was ruled by old Mabel, a big, boned woman with skin like dark velvet and fingers thick with calluses. She had been the estate cook for over 30 years, and no one dared cross her, not even the mistress. Her food kept the big house warm and well-fed, and in the south, that meant power. She ran the kitchen like a ship with rules, knives, and fire. To Josiah, she became something like a shadow mother. At first, Mabel didn't speak to him much. She didn't have to. She'd slap a chicken on the table and say, "Gut." If he hesitated, she'd slap his wrist. Not like that. Like this. She showed him how to break the neck in one motion. No screaming. How to peel the skin back like a glove. How to save every part. Liver, heart, fat, waste was a sin in the kitchen. By the time Josiah turned 11, he could gut a chicken in 20 seconds and have the bones boiling by 30. He learned to butcher pigs, stretch oxhide, smoke meat over sweet wood until the skin crisped like paper. He stirred pots taller than him, learned to read boiling water like language, and watched as Mabel seasoned everything with instinct. No measuring spoons, just memory. She showed him how to balance flavors, how bitter could be turned sweet with molasses, how spoiled meat could be disguised with vinegar and spices. She taught him how to make bread without yeast, stew without salt, soup thick enough to fool any master into thinking he was full. "They love what fools them," she muttered once. Josiah never forgot that. Still, he didn't speak much. He answered with nods, obeyed without sound, but his eyes never stopped moving. Hands watched the guests who came into the kitchen with their greedy tongues and filthy boots, watched the way they ate, the way they chewed, the way they wiped their mouths like kings. Remembered. By 15, Josiah could gut a hog blindfolded. He could prepare a meal for 40 and still have grease on his arms and coals lit before the sun rose. Worked without rest, never complained, never raised his voice. The mistress loved him for that, said he had a quiet spirit. The master called him Golden Hands. Guests praised his food in long drunken rants, saying he must have been touched by God. Some even asked if he could be loaned to neighboring plantations for special dinners. Just bowed his head and said, "Yes, sir," or "No." But in his mind he was building a library, a thick secret ledger of everything they said, everything they ate, everything that made them weak. Remembered who had ulcers, who always reached for more cream, who couldn't handle garlic, who left the table groaning. He filed it all away like recipes. Because Josiah wasn't cooking for praise, he was cooking for knowledge. He wasn't stirring to please, he was preparing. What the white folks mistook for obedience was actually surveillance. What they thought was humility was a silence made of sharpened edges. Sometimes at night when the fire burned low and Mabel slept on her stool with a rag over her face, Josiah would experiment. He'd crush leaves into paste and mix them with lard. He'd melt herbs into oils, dry seeds until they cracked, test their bitterness on his tongue, just enough to know their sting. Took miniature meals in clay bowls, adding, subtracting, adjusting. Wasn't trying to poison, not yet. He was trying to understand how people could die from flavor. When he was 17, he witnessed a guest from Charleston choke violently after eating shrimp cooked in garlic butter. The man's throat swelled like a hog bladder, and he collapsed under the table, frothing. Was an allergic reaction. Josiah stared at the half-eaten plate and thought, garlic can be a blade. That night, he began writing combinations in his mind. Sweet plus root oil equals vomiting. Shellfish plus wine equals swelling. Certain seeds equals blood thinning. New language, a deadly one. Kitchen responsibilities. Mabel had grown too old. Her hands slow, her eyes cloudy. She trusted him completely. He cooked everything for the master. The guests, even the pastor who visited once a month. Josiah's reputation grew far beyond the estate. People talked about that slave boy with the hands of gold. They joked he could make bark taste good. Some even said he was God's own cook. But Josiah didn't believe in God. Not anymore. Not after his father. Not after his mother. Not after watching too many people treated like dogs while the masters feasted and laughed. What Josiah believed in was balance, and in the slow, deliberate way justice could be served hot. There were days he'd look around the big house dining room and study the faces of the men and women seated at the long table. They laughed with full mouths, wiped grease from their lips with embroidered cloths, complimented him without looking him in the eye. He'd stand in the doorway and say yes sir, or more tea, while quietly noting how their skin looked. Dry, swollen red. Was their stomach unsettled? Were they tired afterward? Each plate became a test. Each body subject. But he waited. Years he waited because revenge was not a thing to be thrown like a stone. It was a dish. And Josiah was learning how to cook it perfectly, slowly, without smoke, without suspicion, and deep beneath the quiet, behind every yes massa, behind every roasted chicken and buttery pie, behind every biscuit placed with care on a plate gilded in gold, something had taken root inside Josiah. It wasn't rage, not the kind that screamed. It was hunger. Not for food. He'd never cared for the taste. Not for approval. Despised their praise. It was a hunger for control, for balance, for a world that answered for what it had taken from his mother's body, from his father's pride, from his own silent soul. And when that hunger ripened, he would serve it one bite at a time. The first of all was a man named Mr. Thaddeus Cullen, a cousin from Charleston who visited once every few months uninvited, but always welcomed. He was the kind of white man the others whispered about behind closed doors, too loud, too drunk, too eager to touch what wasn't his. His boots were always muddy with some girl's shame. Laugh echoed across the veil like a crow's cackle. When he drank, which was often, he liked to tell stories about the wild things he'd done in New Orleans. The overseers smirked, the women stiffened, the slaves turned their eyes away. Cullen was a predator wrapped in silk. He wore expensive coats with gold buttons, and called the cook's staff his little flavors. He'd ruffle the hair of young housegirls like pets and joked that they should come season his bed. Josiah had watched him for years, seen the bruises Cullen left on wrists, heard the muffled sobs behind pantry doors after his visits. He always got away with it, said it was just the Southern way. Boys will be boys, the master once said, dismissing a girl's complaint like a fly from his wine glass. By the time Cullen arrived that spring, Josiah had already been testing his ingredients in secret for over a year, not to kill, but to understand what dosage caused dizziness. Combination of roots and ash led to nausea, but no fever, which seeds could sit in a man's stomach like heat without boiling over. He journaled in his head like a scientist and buried his failed experiments behind the smokehouse. And now Cullen had returned. Hungrier, louder. That afternoon Cullen ordered lamb stew, rich, greasy, just how he liked it. Josiah prepared it with care. Garlic, cloves, yams roasted in honey, and a powder he had ground just that morning from dried seed pods he had crushed with the blunt end of a meat mallet. The powder was bitter on the tongue, but in a pot of stew masked with fat and cinnamon, it dissolved without a trace. It wasn't even poison. Not really. Not in the lethal sense. A root blend, he discovered, that intensified the body's own bile, made it eat itself slowly from the inside. Right amount would cause cramps, then vomiting, then silence. Cullen licked his fingers like a dog. He burped and said, "It was the best damn stew I've had in years." He laughed at Josiah when he brought him more cornbread, called him my golden __, and reached out to pat his cheek. Held perfectly still. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, just bowed slightly, stepped away. That night, the screams started. They came from the guest quarters just after midnight. A guttural, wet sound like something inside Cullen was trying to crawl out. The entire household stirred. The mistress lit candles. The master cursed under his breath. They found Cullen on the floor, drenched in sweat, vomiting dark brown sludge onto the rug. His eyes bulged, his stomach convulsed. He moaned for water, then for whiskey, then for God. No one knew what to do. Arrived before dawn, drunk and bleary-eyed. He sniffed the puddle of vomit and said it smelled like bad liquor. He drank too much, the doctor muttered. Charleston whiskey will kill a man faster than war. They laid Cullen in the guest bed, but by then his breath had slowed. His lips were turning blue. He died quietly as the sun began to rise, his mouth open and crooked, like it had been frozen mid-joke. The house fell into a stunned silence. Cullen's body was cleaned and dressed. The mistress wept as they loaded him into a cart bound for Charleston. She placed a white rose on his chest and whispered, "At least his last meal was something he loved." Josiah stood at the top of the kitchen steps, watching the cart vanish into the trees. He didn't blink, didn't sigh, but something inside him, deep in the hollow part of his chest where grief had once lived, felt full. He sat by the fire pit alone. The embers hissed softly. He stared into them like a man watching a sermon. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about measurements or ingredients. He was listening to his own heartbeat. Slow, steady, heavy like footsteps across a dirt road. He had done it not out of rage, not out of impulse, but with planning, with care, and no one had suspected him. The satisfaction wasn't loud. It didn't explode like fireworks. It settled like a well-cooked broth in the gut. In the days that followed, Josiah returned to his duties with mechanical precision. He served tea to the mistress, baked bread for the field hands, scrubbed blood from the butcher table. Nothing changed. No one looked at him differently. The house buzzed with Gossip about Cullen's death. Some said it was a curse. Others said the whiskey had rotted his soul. But no one blamed the cook. They never did. That's when Josiah realized something vital was invisible. People didn't question what fed them. If it tasted good, couldn't be bad. And if it came from black hands, it was even easier to dismiss. They saw him as talent, not the threat, as decoration, not danger. And that meant he had power. Undetectable, absolute power in every pot, every roast, every plate served with a bow. He began to move differently. After Cullen's death, not arrogantly, just purposefully, he paid closer attention to who visited the plantation, who dined in the big house, who disrespected the workers in hushed ways. He kept a mental list, not of enemies but of tastes, who liked their food spicy, who always asked for more butter, who avoided beans, who cleaned their plate, down to the bone. He didn't want to kill randomly. That would be noise. Josiah despised noise. What he wanted was precision, measured justice, to serve retribution, one bite at a time. No blood on the floors, no suspicion in the air, just illness, quiet deaths. The kind of deaths white doctors explained away with lies and arrogance. He wasn't just a cook now, he was a composer, surgeon, a god behind the stove. Late one evening while cleaning the copper pans, Mabel, old half-blind Mabel, shuffled past him and paused. She tilted her head as if trying to read his silhouette in the lamplight. Then she said softly, "You cooking different these days?" Josiah didn't turn around. He wiped the pan once more and said, "Just refining the flavor." Mabel stared a moment longer, then walked away. Tarfest never asked again. That spring, guests continued to arrive. Dinners grew more elaborate. The master grew more proud. Efficient, stood at the center of it all, seasoning every dish with a calmness that bordered on holy. Inside him, beneath the apron and ash, something else was rising. Not just hunger, not just vengeance, but confidence. The kind that comes after a first kill. The kind that sharpens you into something no one sees coming. And as the house laughed over desserts and toasted to their own power, Josiah watched, waited, and planned his next plate. By the time a full year had passed since Mr. Cullen's death, Josiah had evolved from cook to craftsman, not of food alone, but of something far more precise. Death without suspicion. What had begun as an emotional release now transformed into a practice, a process, an art. Each morning Josiah worked the kitchen like a priest at an altar, slicing, stirring, mixing, but beneath the surface of his rituals, another layer simmered, one few could see. He wasn't merely feeding the white mouths that sang his praises. He was watching, measuring, and refining every step. Justice, he realized, was not found in fire and fury. It was found in control. Measured doses, hidden bitterness beneath sweetness. The hearth's glow faded, and the world grew silent. Josiah would slip away to the back of the estate where stray dogs and half-wild cats lingered near the smokehouse. These animals were his test subjects, the early tasters of his evolving arsenal. He'd mix minute quantities of root powders and crushed bark into scraps of meat, observing carefully which creatures staggered, which ones vomited, which went still. He documented it all in his mind. Texture, delay between ingestion and symptom, no notebook, just memory. Trusted no paper. He found an unlikely assistant in Sarabith, a young slave, girl no older than 12, with long fingers and a curiosity that could get her killed. She thought he was teaching her about healing, how to make pickuses and tinctures for fevers and headaches. Josiah never corrected her. He taught her how to dry leaves under certain moonlight, how to grind bitter roots until they resembled cinnamon dust. Thought she was learning medicine. In truth, she was grinding death into dust. One afternoon as they worked behind the smokehouse, Sarabeth looked up and asked, "Uncle Joe, what's this one for?" Josiah didn't miss a beat. "It helps people sleep." She smiled and nodded. "Going to use it on the mistress. She don't sleep at all." Josiah's knife paused mid-chop. He looked at her, her innocence, her rawness, and forced a faint smile. Maybe one day. She laughed and kept pounding. She didn't understand what she was helping to create. She didn't need to. The poisons he favored weren't flashy. No frothing at the mouth. No purple skin or violent collapse. That was theater, and Josiah hated theater. His blends mimicked common southern afflictions: typhoid, heat stroke, foodborne fevers, even mild strokes. A man could dine on his pork roast on Sunday, walk and work all Monday, then drop to his knees with seizures by Tuesday night. Weak heart or bad luck. They always did. Josiah started small, selecting victims with surgical precision. His first was a merchant named Benton Graves, a sweaty, cruel man who came monthly to inspect the younger slaves before they were sold downriver. He treated children like cattle, checking their teeth, their joints, even their thighs, laughing while their mothers cried. In pork belly soaked in a plum reduction, with just a whisper of his most bitter compound stirred into the glaze. Died 4 days later, vomiting blood, blind in one eye. The plantation doctor blamed. Bad meat picked up in Charleston. No one questioned the cook. Josiah served soup during the wake. Next came Reverend Fielding, a man of the cloth who dined at the estate after Sunday sermons, preached about order and obedience, and once said slaves should be grateful for the Christian kindness of their masters. After lunch one Sabbath, he cornered a teenage girl in the barn. She returned with her dress torn, weeping. Josiah made him sweet potato pie that day, Fielding's favorite, but this time the powder came from a flowering vine Josiah had never dared use before. The effect was slow: aching joints, fever, paralysis, hallucinations. Fielding was taken home delirious, singing psalms with a twitching mouth. He died a week later. The obituary blamed summer out. Josiah baked biscuits for the funeral party. And then there was Mr. Langdon, the guest who called slaves furniture in front of their children, a loud drunk who wiped his mouth with his sleeves and boasted about burning a runaway alive. Josiah gave him okra stew with crab meat and rice, seasoned perfectly, gently laced with something only Josiah had mastered. Langdon fell into violent convulsions by dawn and died before the midday bell. His tongue swelled, his eyes turned inward. No one at the big house wept for Langdon, but they still never suspected. Josiah, that was his power, his invisibility. Slaves weren't supposed to be clever. They weren't supposed to be careful. They were supposed to be obedient, disposable, and that was the weakness Josiah exploited. He always showed up during their illness. Kind, always present. He brought them broth when they couldn't hold down solid food. He mopped their sweat with cool rags. He whispered comfort when no one else wanted to touch them. They trusted him. Even as their bowels loosened and their skin grew yellow, they trusted him, and he watched them. Not with pity, with study. He watched their bodies betray them, watched the strength leave their limbs, the terror build behind their eyes, watched them shrivel the way his mother had, drained slowly by suffering. Still, when the last breath slipped past their lips like steam from a pot, Josiah would exhale deeply, as if the tension in his chest had finally broken. Only then could he sleep. Some nights he would sit by the ashes of the fire, barefoot in the dirt, watching the sky. He didn't pray. He didn't speak. He just listened to the frogs, the night wind, the hum of insects. The world was quieter after a death, the air crisper, more honest. No one ever questioned the coincidence of the illnesses. No one connected the dots between guests who once mocked the slaves and their sudden decline. Death was common in the South. Fevers swept through like storms. Heat killed more than bullets. The South eats its own. The master once said after a neighbor died of heat stroke in his garden, and Josiah had become the weather. He kept no trophies, no written records, only memory. He never killed in anger. He killed in calculation. When he walked past the graves of his victims, he didn't smile, he didn't gloat, simply acknowledged them as ingredients in a larger dish, a long overdue balancing of the scales, and though he never said it out loud, there was one truth burning quietly in his chest. Each death was a hymn, a note in a song only he could hear, a song for his father, hung like meat from a tree, a song for his mother swallowed by the river, a song for every scream they were never allowed to release. Quiet boy from the kitchen, the one who never smiled, never cried, never spoke above a whisper, had become the composer of their requiem, one bite at a time, behind the smokehouse, past the pig pens, and the sagging fences no one bothered to repair. The woods thickened into a forgotten corner of the Middleton estate. The trees there were older, gnawed like clenched fists, and the ground stayed damp year-round, where Josiah buried his work. The stray cats, dogs, rats, and sums he'd fed his early mixtures to. It was a quiet cemetery of his failures and lessons, stitched into the soil like pages of a book no one would ever read. But the dirt doesn't keep secrets forever. One humid afternoon in late June, with cicadas shrieking like sirens, and the sun stuck heavy in the sky, a mongrel dog with patchy fur began digging near the chicken coop. It had wandered in from the neighboring field, sniffing and scratching obsessively at the damp soil. A few children working nearby laughed at first until the dog unearthed something white, something small. Jawbone, human, tiny. Panic passed through the slave quarters like a brush. Some said it was from a runaway child sold years ago. Others whispered about a baby born dead in the night and buried in secret. But most of the whispers settled on one name, Josiah. They remembered how he spent hours behind the smokehouse alone, how he boiled things in clay pots when the kitchen was closed, how sometimes the meat smelled off strange even though the white folks never noticed. A few said they'd seen him talking to bones, laying them out like puzzle pieces before turning them to ash. Field hands began to murmur when he passed. Some turned their backs. Others left small bundles of herbs or nails outside their doors, crude protections against dark spirits. "He ain't just cooking," old Nettie said, her voice raspy as dried corn husk. She'd been on the plantation longer than anyone, blind in one eye and twice widowed. She sat outside her cabin most days, shelling peas and muttering to herself. That night, she spoke louder than usual, his remembering every cut, every name, that boy cooking ghosts into the meals. Children were warned not to follow Josiah. Boys who used to sneak into the smokehouse to steal drippings or burnt bread began giving the kitchen a wide berth. But Josiah said nothing, did nothing, just kept cooking silently, meticulously, as if nothing in the world had changed. Still, the tension crept closer. Mr. Platt, the overseer, had never liked Josiah. The boy never looked scared. How he worked too clean, too quiet. Slaves. His mind was supposed to groan and sweat and cry when ordered. But Josiah never made noise. He just watched. It made Platt nervous. When the jawbone turned up, Platt's attention shifted. Began watching Josiah closer, hanging near the kitchen more often, stepping into the smokehouse unannounced. He asked questions. How long the meat had been curing, what was in the rub, why the fire pit burned so late. Josiah answered in flat tones, always respectful, always vague. Platt didn't find anything, but that made him angrier. He started blaming Josiah for things. Meat spoiling, knives misplaced, the illness of a guest who'd clearly drunk too much. Josiah never argued, just nodded and fixed what needed fixing, but something in his eyes had changed. A flicker of calculation, stillness of a blade before it drops. Then one afternoon, Platt made a mistake. A young slave boy named Elijah, no more than 11, collapsed in the field from sunstroke. He'd been coughing all morning, pale and weak, but Platt refused to let him rest. When Elijah finally fell face first into the dirt, Platt flew into a rage. He dragged the boy behind the barn and beat him with a switch until the skin on his back split open. When he ran out of switch, he used his fists. By the time he stopped, Elijah was barely breathing. His ribs cracked and one arm bent at a wrong angle. Josiah watched it happen from the kitchen window. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. That night he made pork roast glazed in sorghum, lined with rosemary, and accompanied by thick cornbread, soaked in buttermilk. He brought a full plate to Platt himself. Unsteady, gaze low. "You eat yet?" Platt grunted, mouth already half full. "No, sir," Josiah said. "Not yet." Platt grunted something about damn shame. "Feeding you better than the stock," and shoved another forkful into his mouth. Josiah returned to the kitchen, washed his hands twice, and went to sleep early. 3 days later, Platt woke up, coughing blood. By noon he couldn't stand. By nightfall he was convulsing in his bunk, choking on his own lungs. His chest filled with fluid so fast, the doctor barely had time to listen before declaring it lung rot, a common diagnosis used when they couldn't find a cause. The master ordered the body buried before sunrise, fearing spread. No funeral, no sermon. Josiah served bacon and corn grits to the house the next morning. No one said a word, but the slaves knew. They didn't speak it aloud, but the fear changed. It turned to awe. Women began leaving bundles of sage and tobacco at Josiah's door, not as warnings, but as offerings. Reverence grew around him. He had become more than a cook. He had become a force. Not just vengeance, but balance. Old Nettie was the only one who dared say it straight. "He ain't like us anymore. That boy done crossed somewhere else. He feed in something bigger now." And yet Josiah remained unchanged on the outside. Still stirred with the same steady rhythm, still chopped with the same precision, still answered every boy with "yes, sir." But inside him the ledger was growing. Every cruelty, every insult, every bruise he saw and could not stop. They were ingredients waiting. He didn't act on anger. He acted on memory. Each death was not vengeance, was a recipe completed. And now even the soil whispered his name. Arrived on a warm Tuesday morning in mid-October, dressed in city shoes and coated in northern curiosity. His name was Mr. Horace Lyle, a journalist from Philadelphia with a sharp chin and sharper questions. He'd been traveling across the South collecting stories for a piece titled "The Southern Soul, Hospitality, Industry, and the Grace of the Gentleman." He was welcomed at the Middleton estate like a visiting prince. The master, eager to be portrayed as a benevolent figure, poured bourbon with both hands and instructed the house to offer only the finest. The mistress had fresh linen set out, and even the porch dogs were scrubbed clean. The slaves were warned: smile, move quickly, say nothing unless asked. The plantation was to look like heaven carved into cotton fields, to stay buried like bones behind the smokehouse. Lyle was polite, but observant. He took notes constantly. Asked about yield and harvest, about food, structure, and Negro contentment. He smiled often, but his eyes were always working. He watched too closely, listened too carefully. Even Josiah noticed the way Lyle's gaze lingered on the kitchen door longer than necessary. The way he watched who bowed deepest, who flinched when called. Master requested a dinner worthy of being written into history. Josiah was ready. He didn't rush. He didn't sweat. He moved like he always did, silent, exacting calm. Roasted duck breast, seared in brown butter and thyme, finished with a glaze of molasses and fire cider alongside it wild greens, cornbread soaked in lard and honey, and a chilled dessert of apple slices poached in spiced sugar syrup. Josiah served it himself, one plate at a time. He did not poison it. Not truly. Not this time. But he added a trace compound, something he had been refining for months. A bitter oil extracted from the pit of a certain seed, diluted until nearly tasteless, but potent enough to unsettle the body for hours. The kind of thing that didn't kill but reminded. Lyle ate slowly, savored every bite. He complimented the duck 3 times, asked if Josiah had ever cooked in Charleston. Josiah replied only once. No, sir. Disappeared into the shadows of the kitchen. That night, just past 2 a.m., Sel woke up retching, his gut twisted into itself. His skin turned clammy and pale, Polway in his nightshirt, knocking over a candlestick, moaning for water. The mistress found him crouched by the wall, drenched in sweat, whispering, "It was the food, it was the food." Summoned the doctor, but Lyle refused to be examined. He insisted on leaving. "Something's wrong here," he muttered, clutching his coat. The air is too still." By dawn he was gone, packed up and wheeled down the long dirt road. Too sick to ride, too shaken to look back. In a northern paper, the headline read, "Where the Magnolia Wilts, a visit to Middleton Plantation." The first few paragraphs praised the scenery, the stately columns, the aroma of fresh bread from the kitchen. Turned. In one passage, Al wrote, "There is something here I cannot name. The food is exquisite, the servants polite, the rooms pristine, yet I felt as though I were eating in a house built atop a grave. There is silence here, not peace, but a hush, as if something is being concealed beneath politeness, something rotted just under the skin." Read the article in his study, jaw clenched tight. He cursed Lyle as an ungrateful liar. The mistress polled that night. She lit 3 candles and began to pray, not for the visitor, but for the house. She whispered prayers into the rafters, burned herbs brought by old Nettie, and placed a Bible under her pillow. Meanwhile, the master began, sleeping with a pistol under his nightstand. He claimed it was to protect against potential uprisings, but everyone knew he feared something less visible, less explainable. Still, asked Josiah to cook for every guest. They never stopped. His food was too perfect, his silence too comforting. Family mistook for loyalty, a mistake many had made and many had not lived to correct. They never asked where Josiah had learned to pair duck fat with vinegar syrup. They never asked how he kept meat fresh without salt in the worst heat of summer. They didn't question how he knew exactly when to pull bread before it scorched, or how his hands never trembled, even with blades. They didn't know about the wall behind the pantry door, hidden behind hanging ladles and sacks of dried beans. The backboard away. Only he knew about the jagged charcoal lines faint in the dark, names etched one by one into the wood, some with dates, some with a single mark. Beside them, a crooked cross or a circle. There were 29 names when Lyle visited. 29 people who had died, vanished, or suffered unexplainable illnesses since Josiah began cooking on his own. Most of them white, most of them cruel, every one of them deserving in his eyes. Josiah would sometimes run his fingers over the wood, not as a ritual, but as a reminder, a list not of victims, but of lessons. Some deaths had been too fast, some had taken too long, some had raised questions, others had disappeared into silence like sugar into tea. He learned from each one, and now he had a visitor's name to add. Hadn't died, but he had come close, and more importantly, he had spoken, written, published. He had felt something even if he couldn't name it. That mattered. That was progress. A spark beneath the magnolia leaves. The days that followed, things grew quieter in the house. Not in routine, the same dinners, the same cotton, weighed and hauled, but in spirit. The laughter around the table became hollow. The master drank more. The mistress prayed longer. Dine at Middleton began declining invitations. The reputation of the estate shifted slowly, subtly from admiration to something closer to fear. Yet in the kitchen Josiah remained the same. He stirred with precision, cut with care. He served without hesitation. He answered every call, and behind his eyes there was no storm, only still water, cold, reflective, deep enough to drown in. Because Josiah understood something now, something few ever truly grasp. Real power is not loud, doesn't scream, it doesn't show its teeth. Real power is invisible, like heat in a stew, like poison in honey, like a name carved into a wall no one sees until it's far too late. And Josiah had never felt more powerful. It was not the preacher, not the overseer, not the merchant, or the man who drank from silver cups. No, it was the child's bone that shattered the silence. The boy, no older than 3, had come to the Middleton estate with his mother, distant cousin of the mistress visiting from Charleston, blonde curls, skin like milk, and a cry sharp enough to wake the dad. He was the kind of child white folks adored and slaves feared because children like that could point, accuse, break things and never suffer consequence. He followed chickens through the fields, climbed under tables during dinner, wandered in and out of rooms without permission, and one morning he disappeared. At first, they thought he was hiding. He was known to play tricks, stuffing himself under bed frames, crawling into empty crates. As the sun sank lower and the laughter around the house dissolved into rising voices, concern turned to panic. Mother screamed his name into the woods until her voice broke. The master ordered every slave to stop working. "Find him," he bellowed, "or you'll all wish you were dead." The search lasted 2 days. Men combed the fields. Dogs sniffed the dirt paths. They overturned barrels, checked wells, tore through the kitchen storage, and even sent riders to the nearby river, fearing the worst. It was on the 3rd day, in the thick heat of dusk, that the scent led them to the smokehouse. The fire had been low. Josiah had said he was rendering fat, keeping bones for broth. No one questioned him. He was, after all, just the cook. But when one of the hounds began pawing violently at the fire pit, whimpering as smoke curled from the ashes, the men dragged shovels and tongs into the coals. That's when they pulled it out. A bone, short, pale, burned, black at one end. A femur far too small to have belonged to any animal. The room went still. The heat seemed to vanish. A scream rang out, though no one could later say from whom. Panic ignited like gunpowder. The search ended. Punishment began. They lined up the slaves and whipped them in batches. Questions, only blows. Men bled from the back before they had a chance to protest. Women were dragged from their beds. The stable boy was nearly drowned in the horse rough. Babies were torn from their mothers, and examined as if more bones might tumble from their mouths. But Josiah was untouched. The master waved him off. "Here's the cook," he said, rubbing his temples. "He feeds us." He wouldn't. And Josiah stood quietly in the doorway of the kitchen, watching the chaos he had not caused, but had always known would come. His face was unreadable, calm, his apron still damp with broth. The whipping continued for 2 days. Then on the 3rd morning, just as dawn broke and the fields glistened with dew and blood, a field hand broke. His name was Isaac. He was 16, skinny, jumpy, with a gash across his left cheek from the lashes. He hadn't meant to speak, but the sight of another boy being beaten, his screams raw and unending, cracked something inside him. "Check the floorboards," he said. Barely a whisper, but it was enough. They dragged Josiah from the kitchen, stormed inside. The pantry was emptied, sacks tossed, spice jars shattered. A while, nothing, just shelves and brick. But then one of the houseboys noticed a strange seam behind the dried bean sacks, a board that didn't match the others. When pried open, it revealed a hollow space no wider than a coffin pressed between 2 walls. Inside were jars, dozens of them, powders of every color, some green as rot, some red, rust, some gray as ash. A few jars had labels smudged beyond reading. Held dried herbs carefully tied in cloth, but it was the pouch of teeth that stopped them cold, a simple brown satchel cinched tight with twine, filled with human myrrhs and incisors, their roots blackened by time or fire. Behind it all, scratched into the wooden wall with charcoal and knife tip, was a list, 27 names, dates, notes, doses, some marked with crosses, some underlined, some with words like quick, or boiled or delayed. Every single name matched a guest who had died mysteriously: a merchant, a reverend, an overseer, a cousin, a neighbor. Hadn't even been remembered until that moment, but there they were, etched into the wood like a church ledger. Master collapsed into a chair, sweat poured down his temples. The list fluttered in his hands like scripture. The mistress, upon hearing what was found, fainted outright, crashing to the floor in her lace dress. No one caught her. Josiah didn't run. He didn't cry. When they surrounded him, torches raised, pistols drawn, he didn't plead. He stood beside the fire pit, hands at his sides, eyes fixed on the sky, as if measuring the weather. Asked, a whisper at first, then louder. "Why the hell would you do this?" Josiah turned slowly, his expression flat. His voice was as calm as ever, the same voice they'd heard offering second helpings of pie or announcing supper was ready. "I just fed them," he said. "Them like they fed us." The words hung in the air like smoke. No one moved. No one spoke. They understood, and they didn't. It was madness. It was clarity. Both. He was chained before sunset, but in the hours between his arrest and his cell, something changed on the plantation. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was thick, suffocating. If the ground itself was choking on the truth, servants refused to enter the kitchen. Some wouldn't eat. The fire pit was doused, then rebuilt, then doused again. They couldn't get the smell out. Not of smoke, but something beneath it. Something metallic, something human. Mistress would never again eat meat. The master developed a tremor in his right hand. They stopped taking visitors, stopped hosting parties, and behind the wall, the list remained, 27 names, written in a hand that never shook. They hanged him 2 days later. No judge was summoned. No preacher read from scripture. No white man dared offer a prayer over the body of the cook who had turned meals into death. The rope was already waiting before dawn, looped over the same cypress tree where his father had once swayed in silence. A crowd gathered, restless and tight-lipped, some desperate to forget, others desperate to see the monster they had allowed to grow beneath their roof. Josiah said nothing as they dragged him from the shed where he'd been held. He didn't beg. He didn't curse. His eyes were calm, distant, as if he had already left this place days ago. But before the noose touched his skin, he made one final request. Not to be spared, not for his freedom. He simply said, "Let me cook." It was not a threat, not a plea, just a quiet declaration of what he was. Even now, even at the edge of death. The mistress screamed at the suggestion, wailing that he'd poison them all. Master hesitated, face pale and slick with sweat, but in the end he nodded. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was fear, or perhaps deep down they all knew that whatever Josiah had become, his hands were still the steadiest in the house. He returned to the kitchen without chains. No guards followed him in. He walked barefoot over the stone floor, every step deliberate. The fire was already lit. The utensils, his old blades and pans, rested exactly where he had left them. He cooked in silence, measuring spoons, no notes, just memory and motion. He prepared fried corn cakes with golden crusts, smoked rabbit glazed with sage and vinegar, and brewed syrup tea dark enough to stain porcelain. Powders, no poisons, just food, the purest expression of who he had once been before the taste of grief made its way into his hands. When the meal was done, he plated everything with precision and placed the dishes on the kitchen table. He didn't eat. He didn't offer it to anyone. He simply stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the steam rising from the plates like incense from an altar. Word. He turned, extended his wrists, and walked back outside. They hanged him just before sunset. The wind was still, the sky a soft orange, as if the world had paused to watch. No one in the crowd spoke. When the trap dropped and Josiah's body snapped midair, some looked away, but most stared, waiting to feel something they never would. Relief didn't come. Closure didn't arrive. There was only the echo of the rope creaking as his body swayed, and the sudden realization that something had just ended and something else had begun. They buried him behind the kitchen, not in the slave graveyard, not near the field hands, alone, away, as if even in death, he was too dangerous to be near others. There was no marker, just dirt and rocks packed hastily, but the earth rejected him. Within weeks the grass over his grave shriveled. By spring it was dust. Chickens refused to walk across it. Dogs howled when they passed. One worker claimed he saw smoke rising from the ground before dawn. Another swore he found the faint scent of roasting meat in the air, though no fire had been lit. The years passed. Kitchen was cleaned, but never quite the same. No one could get rid of the lingering odor, a mixture of ash, thyme, and something metallic. The fire pit collapsed. No cook ever lasted long in that room. The master stopped eating there. The mistress rarely left her bedroom. The laughter that once echoed through the halls faded into quiet footsteps and locked doors. Fire came for the Middleton estate. It started in the kitchen. No lightning strike. No candle left burning. Flames rising from nowhere, crawling across the roof like vines, consuming everything. The house screamed as it burned. The walls cracked. The portraits blistered. By dawn, nothing stood but a charred skeleton of beams and brick. The official story was a storm, bad luck, God's will. But those who remember Josiah said otherwise, said he had come back, that his spirit had risen from the unmarked grave, that he'd stoked the fire himself, one log at a time, just as he once did when preparing dinner. Say he's still out there in the ashes, in the wind, still stirring, still cooking, still hungry. Not for food, but for justice, for memory, for the world. To taste what it did to him. And until it does, the fire in his soul will never go out.